In every city, beneath the noise of progress, there lies a buried story, one written in fear, blood, and silence. Welcome to Shadow Chapters, where we uncover the dark events history tried to forget. If you haven't already, subscribe and join us as we journey through the forgotten corners of the past, where truth is often more haunting than fiction. Tonight we travel back to the summer of 1919, a city on edge, a nation divided, and a single stone thrown on the waters of Lake Michigan. That set Chicago on fire. This is the story of the Chicago Race Riot of 1919. Chicago in 1919 was a city of iron, smoke, and ambition, a restless metropolis built by hands from every corner of the world. Its railways groaned with the movement of steel, its stockyards screamed with the sound of slaughter, and its streets pulsed with the dream of prosperity. But beneath the surface, the city was a powder keg, a fragile balance between hope and hatred, progress and prejudice. At the turn of the 20th century, the Great Migration had begun. Tens of thousands of African Americans left the Jim Crow South, fleeing the noose, the whip, and the crushing laws of segregation. They boarded northbound trains with little more than faith and a suitcase, believing that in the North they would finally be free. Chicago seemed to promise everything: jobs, housing, dignity. But when they arrived, they found a city already bursting at the seams, where poverty and prejudice wore a new face. The industrial boom had drawn immigrants from Ireland, Poland, Lithuania, Italy, men who labored long hours in the stockyards, steel mills, and factories. They lived in cramped, dirty neighborhoods where opportunity and exhaustion coexisted. And when black workers arrived willing to work for less, they were seen not as neighbors, but as rivals. The seeds of resentment were sown. By 1919, Chicago's black population had swelled to nearly 110,000, double what it had been a decade earlier. Most lived in a narrow strip of the South Side known as the Black Belt, a dense, segregated neighborhood where landlords charged high rents for crumbling apartments. The invisible lines of segregation were everywhere, in jobs, in schools, and most of all, in housing. White residents and real estate agents enforced unwritten laws. Blacks could live here, but not there. They could swim on one side of the beach, but not the other. They could work in the factories, but rarely advance. The city's politicians exploited these divisions. In the Stockyard District, Irish political machines controlled jobs, housing, and the police. These bosses used fear of black migration to rally white working-class loyalty, turning neighbors into enemies. Meanwhile, black Chicagoans built their own thriving institutions, churches, newspapers, and social clubs that gave identity and pride to a growing community. The Chicago Defender, the most influential black newspaper in America, chronicled both their progress and their pain. It celebrated black soldiers returning from World War I, men who had fought for democracy abroad, only to face racial hatred at home. These returning veterans carried something dangerous back with them: dignity. They refused to bow. They refused to be silent. And to many white Chicagoans, that defiance was unforgivable. The riot in Chicago was not an isolated spark. Across America, 1919 became known as the Red Summer, a season when racial violence swept through dozens of cities and towns. From Washington, D.C. to Knoxville, from Longview to Omaha, white mobs attacked black communities with guns, torches, and rope. The causes were complex: a nation reeling after war, a collapsing economy, housing shortages, and fear. But at its core was a single truth: black progress was rising, and white supremacy was pushing back. In Chicago, the tension was electric. The police were overwhelmingly white, many with open hostility toward black residents. Politicians used racial divisions as weapons. Real estate speculators spread rumors that blacks were invading white neighborhoods, driving fear and violence that conveniently preserved property values. By the summer of 1919, it was only a matter of time before something snapped. It was Sunday, July 27, 1919. A day so hot that Chicago's streets shimmered. The city sought relief at its beaches, where the cool waves of Lake Michigan offered escape from the suffocating heat. Among the swimmers that day was a 17-year-old black boy named Eugene Williams. He and his friends built a makeshift raft and paddled into the lake near 29th Street Beach, a place where the water had no official boundary, but an unofficial line drawn by custom and hate. As their raft drifted across the invisible line into the white side of the beach, a group of white men began hurling rocks at them. The boys screamed, ducking under as the stones splashed around them, until one struck Eugene on the head. He slipped beneath the water and never surfaced. When witnesses pointed out the man who had thrown the stone, a white man named George Stauber, the police refused to arrest him. Instead, they arrested a black man for allegedly causing a disturbance. In that moment, the last thread of restraint snapped. Crowds formed on both sides. Anger rippled through the city's south side. As word spread that the boy's killer would go free, Chicago erupted into violence. That night, the first shots were fired. What began as a confrontation on the beach quickly spread through the city like wildfire. White gangs, some numbering in the hundreds, poured into black neighborhoods armed with clubs, knives, and guns. They dragged men and women off streetcars, beat them in alleys, and set homes ablaze. Black residents fought back. Many were veterans, men who had faced German machine guns in the trenches of Europe. They were not about to bow to mobs at home. Gunfire echoed through the narrow streets. Smoke rose over the south side. The police, nearly all white, often stood aside as white mobs attacked, arresting more black victims than white aggressors. Newspapers stoked the panic. Headlines screamed of Negro rioters, painting the black community as the aggressors, even as their homes burned. By the second day, the violence had spiraled out of control. Streetcars stopped running through the south side. Trains carrying black passengers were attacked. The city's meatpacking district, where black and white workers had once labored side by side, became a war zone. The bloodshed would last 5 days. For nearly a week, Chicago was held hostage by chaos. The police were overwhelmed. Some joined the mobs, others simply looked away. White gangs roamed freely, setting fires that consumed entire blocks. Black families fled their homes, carrying what they could. Children clinging to their arms, smoke trailing behind. The Illinois National Guard was finally called in on July 30th. Soldiers marched through the city with bayonets fixed, setting up checkpoints and imposing curfews. But even their presence couldn't erase the terror that had already been unleashed. By the time the violence subsided on August 3rd, the numbers were staggering. 38 people dead, 23 black, 15 white, 537 injured. Over 1,000 black families left homeless. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. The smell of smoke lingered in the air for days. The city returned to work, but nothing was the same again. The fires had quieted, but the wounds of the city were just beginning to open. Chicago was scarred, not only by flames and rubble, but by something far more corrosive: fear. In the smoldering remains of the South Side, the smell of burned wood mixed with the scent of distrust that would hang over the city for decades to come. When the shooting stopped, thousands were left displaced. Families huddled in makeshift shelters, church basements, schools, and public halls, while soldiers patrolled the streets. Mothers searched for sons who hadn't come home. Men walked through the charred streets looking for what was left of their lives. Bodies had been buried quickly, many without ceremony, some never identified. The newspapers spoke of restoration of order, but for the survivors, order had become an illusion. Black Chicagoans rebuilt what they could. Neighbors took in the homeless, pastors opened their doors, and local businesses raised money to help those who had lost everything. There was grief, yes, but also defiance. Beneath the sorrow ran a current of determination. They had endured slavery, lynching, and now this. But they would not be erased. On the other side of the city, white politicians and business owners met in quiet rooms. They spoke of containing the problem, of keeping the peace. But what they truly meant was keeping the color line intact. The city's power brokers, real estate men, ward bosses, police chiefs, had seen what happened when that line blurred. They had no intention of letting it happen again. Mayor William Hale Thompson, a man known more for political theater than leadership, tried to balance the chaos. His administration walked a thin line, condemning the violence but refusing to confront its racial roots. For every word of sympathy, there was another of blame. His police force remained untouched, his allies unmoved. But beneath the surface, something new began to stir. Citizens, black and white, demanded an explanation. They wanted to know how a city could turn on itself so violently, how a single death on a summer's day could unravel an entire metropolis. In response, the state formed the Chicago Commission on Race Relations, a team of scholars, activists, and civic leaders tasked with investigating the causes of the riot. Their report, published 3 years later as The Negro in Chicago, became a mirror held up to the city's soul. It concluded what many already knew, that the riot had not been born from chance, but from years of housing discrimination, economic inequality, and institutional prejudice. The city, the report said, was divided not by streets, but by invisible walls built from fear and greed. The findings were groundbreaking, but few wanted to listen. By the time the report was released in 1922, Chicago had already hardened its lines. Real estate interests had discovered a profitable truth. Fear could be monetized. They called it redlining, the practice of marking neighborhoods on maps with red ink, warning lenders where black families lived. These marked zones were deemed too risky for loans or investment, effectively freezing generations of families in poverty. Banks refused mortgages. Insurance companies denied coverage. Schools deteriorated, and opportunity evaporated. Meanwhile, white flight began, families moving farther south and west, leaving behind neighborhoods they once fought to defend, taking their resources and tax money with them. The city's black population, confined to the south side, grew more crowded by the year. By the 1930s, Chicago's segregation was no longer a custom. It was policy. And it all traced back to that week in 1919, when fire and fury drew the city's racial map in smoke and blood. Those who had lived through the riot carried its memory like a wound that never healed. Parents told their children stories of the summer when mobs roamed the streets and soldiers patrolled the corners. Many children grew up believing the riot was an isolated tragedy. But the truth was more insidious. It was the foundation of the Chicago they would inherit. Decades later, as the city modernized, its divisions only deepened. The skyline rose higher, but the gulf between its people widened. The glittering towers of downtown masked the decay in the neighborhoods below. Politicians spoke of progress, but in the South Side, poverty and neglect became fixtures of daily life. The ghettos created by redlining became traps, invisible prisons where dreams suffocated under the weight of policy and prejudice. Every so often, the city would remember. Another spark of violence, another headline, another promise that things would change. But each time, the roots of the riot reached out from the past, reminding Chicago that its ghosts were never buried. The legacy of 1919 lived on in subtle, brutal ways. In the schools divided by race and funding. In the housing projects built as solutions that became cages. In the whispers of landlords and bankers who still decided who could live where. And in the quiet anger of a generation that refused to forget. For the survivors who had been children during the riot, the memories remained sharp. The sound of gunfire, the smell of smoke, the sight of soldiers marching down their streets. They had watched their city burn for the color of their skin. They had learned early that equality was not a gift, but a fight. Some turned to faith, others to politics. Churches became sanctuaries not just of worship, but of strategy. Ministers preached not only salvation, but justice. The seeds planted in those South Side congregations would one day grow into the roots of the civil rights movement. By the 1950s and 60s, Chicago would again become a battleground, this time over fair housing, education, and voting rights. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. would march through its streets, confronting the same hostility that had erupted 4 decades earlier. He once said that he had never seen resistance as fierce as what he faced in Chicago. The ghosts of 1919 were still whispering. As time passed, the riot slipped from the headlines, buried beneath newer tragedies and changing politics. But history has a way of returning. In the 21st century, scholars and artists began revisiting that week in 1919. Not as a relic, but as a warning. Documentaries, exhibitions, and public memorials tried to resurrect the truth that had been buried for too long. They reminded the city that what happened to Eugene Williams was not an accident. It was a reflection of a nation still learning what freedom meant. His death was not just the beginning of a riot, but the unveiling of an uncomfortable truth, that America's greatest battles were not fought in foreign lands, but in its own neighborhoods, between its own people. A century later, the echoes of that truth remain. Chicago's skyline gleams with progress, but its neighborhoods still bear the scars of division. The segregation maps drawn in red ink 100 years ago still define who lives where, who prospers, and who struggles. For many, the riot of 1919 feels like a chapter closed long ago. But for others, it has never ended. It has only changed form. The fear of the other still shapes politics. The struggle for housing, justice, and equality continues. The fire that burned on the South Side has dimmed, but it was never truly extinguished. And so the story of the Chicago Race Riot is not just a story of violence. It is the story of a city forced to confront itself, of a nation struggling to keep its promises. It is a reminder that progress is fragile, that peace is not permanent, and that history, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to surface. It began with a boy on a raft, a stone cast into the water, and the silence of those who looked away. It ended with a city forever changed, its wounds still visible in the lines that divide its streets. This is not just a tale of the past. It is a mirror held up to the present. A warning that until we face what lies beneath the surface, we are doomed to repeat it. And so as the city sleeps tonight, the waves of Lake Michigan still lap quietly against the shore where Eugene Williams took his last breath. The water is calm now, but beneath it the story stirs, a memory refusing to drown. Time has a way of dulling the edges of pain, but some wounds never close. For Chicago, the riot of 1919 became a wound written into its bones. Decades passed, the city rebuilt, and its people tried to move on. But the ghosts of that summer lingered in the shadows, haunting every promise of progress. In the 1920s, Chicago pulsed with ambition. Jazz clubs lit up the South Side, drawing crowds who sought escape in music and laughter. Bronzeville, once scarred by fire, became a beating heart of black culture. There was pride here, rhythm and resilience. The same streets that had burned now echoed with the sounds of Louis Armstrong's trumpet and Bessie Smith's voice. The community built beauty out of ashes, and for a time it seemed the spirit of the people might overcome the boundaries that had confined them. But the walls never truly fell. The color lines had merely grown invisible, stronger for their subtlety. Banks continued to draw red circles on their maps, and landlords kept their unwritten rules. Even as Black Chicago thrived artistically, it remained cornered economically. The city loved its music but rejected its musicians. Black art was celebrated, but Black lives were still contained. For many families, home ownership was the dream that always remained just out of reach. The federal government's New Deal programs in the 1930s were designed to lift Americans from the Great Depression, but they rarely reached across racial lines. White families received loans to buy homes in new suburban developments, while black families were left behind in aging, overcrowded tenements. The wealth gap widened generation by generation, brick by brick. Meanwhile, the police, those same blue uniforms that had once stood idle during the riot, became a symbol of fear in black neighborhoods. Reports of brutality were met with silence. Complaints vanished in the bureaucracy. Justice remained a stranger. By the 1940s, Chicago had grown into a city of millions, its skyline stretching higher every year. Factories roared, trains thundered, and the war economy brought new jobs. Another wave of black Southerners arrived, drawn north by hope. But once again, they found the same invisible boundaries waiting. White residents, stirred by fear and politicians' whispers, formed neighborhood protection associations. The word protection masked their purpose: to keep black families out. When black families tried to move into white neighborhoods, bricks shattered their windows, and crosses burned on their lawns. In 1947, the murder of a man named William Little, a World War II veteran, shocked the city. His only crime was wearing his uniform while living in a neighborhood that refused to accept him. It was a grim echo of 1919. Another soldier, another life sacrificed to the color line. Yet even amid this hatred, there were voices rising against it. Journalists, preachers, and activists documented the hypocrisy of a city that called itself modern but lived in the past. The Chicago Defender continued to print stories that refused to let the city forget. Its writers called for fair housing, for justice, for the recognition of humanity. They wrote with urgency, as if they knew time itself was running out. By the 1950s, the struggle began to take shape as a movement. Organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League worked tirelessly to challenge discriminatory housing and employment practices. Small victories came, court cases, new laws, but they were often met with defiance and delay. And then came the 1960s, the decade when the nation's buried conflicts erupted into open fire once more. Across America, civil rights marches filled the streets. From Montgomery to Birmingham, from Selma to Washington, Black Americans demanded what had always been theirs: the right to live as equals. Chicago, too, would not remain silent. In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. brought his campaign for open housing to the city, marching through all-white neighborhoods on the southwest side. The reaction was vicious. Crowds hurled rocks and bottles. Some shouted, "Go back to Mississippi!" King, no stranger to danger, later said that the hatred he saw in Chicago was deeper than anything he had faced in the South. It was as if the riot of 1919 had come alive again, wearing a new face but carrying the same soul. The city had changed its skyline, not its heart. King's campaign exposed what many already knew: that segregation in the North was not the absence of Jim Crow, but its evolution. Here, it wore a suit and tie. It hid behind laws, zoning ordinances, and mortgage rates. The chains were invisible, but they were still chains. Despite the hostility, King's marches ignited something in the city's youth. New leaders emerged, bold and unyielding, determined to dismantle the structures their grandparents had been trapped in. The civil rights movement of the South found its echo in the urban streets of Chicago. But progress came at a price. In the years that followed King's assassination, frustration turned into rage. The city saw new riots in 1968 after his death. Flames once again licking the sky, soldiers once again patrolling the streets. The scenes were painfully familiar. It seemed that Chicago was caught in a cruel rhythm, its history repeating like a broken record. In the decades that followed, the language changed, but the divisions remained. Politicians spoke of urban renewal, a phrase that promised revival but delivered displacement. Entire black neighborhoods were bulldozed to make way for highways and new developments. Families who had lived in the same homes for generations were forced to start over, pushed farther to the city's margins. Housing projects like Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor homes were built as modern solutions to poverty, but they soon became vertical prisons, isolated, neglected, and starved of opportunity. The systemic inequalities that had sparked the riot in 1919 evolved into a new form. No longer mobs in the streets, but policies in boardrooms. Yet even in the darkest corners, the flame of resistance never died. The same defiance that had burned in 1919 still burned in the hearts of Chicago's people. Activists, artists, teachers, and parents continued the fight, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, but always relentlessly. The memory of Eugene Williams never completely faded. His story passed down like a secret, whispered in classrooms and told in community centers. Each retelling carried a question. How far have we really come? The city began slowly to confront its past. Historians revisited the riot with new eyes, uncovering police records, newspaper clippings, and forgotten testimonies. What they found was not just the story of a riot, but a pattern, a blueprint of systemic failure and survival. In the early 21st century, artists turned that pain into expression. Murals appeared across the South Side, depicting Eugene's raft on the lake, the faces of those lost, the flames that once consumed the city. Schools began teaching about the Red Summer, and community groups held vigils on the beaches where it all began. For many, these acts were not just remembrance, they were reclamation, taking control of a story that had long been told by others, restoring dignity to names once buried in the footnotes of history. And still, the struggle continues. The echoes of that week in 1919 can be heard in today's debates over housing, policing, and justice. Each protest, each march, each demand for accountability carries the weight of that history. The faces have changed, but the questions remain painfully familiar. Why do some neighborhoods thrive while others crumble? Why does opportunity follow one color and abandon another? Why does the past refuse to stay in the past? Chicago has tried to answer these questions for more than a century. Its skyline gleams as a testament to human ambition, but its divisions reveal the price of forgetting. The same city that once called itself the engine of progress still struggles to reconcile its own reflection. And yet, there is hope in that struggle. For every act of hatred, there have been countless acts of resilience. For every stone thrown, hands have risen to rebuild. For every life lost, voices have risen to remember. The story of the Chicago Race Riot is not only one of destruction, it is one of endurance. The people who survived carried more than pain. They carried lessons. They taught their children that silence is complicity, that justice requires vigilance, that equality is not granted but earned every single day. Those lessons became the foundation upon which new generations would stand. A century has passed since that hot July afternoon when a boy's body sank beneath the waves. The lake that once reflected violence now reflects skyscrapers. But if you stand on the shore at 29th Street and close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of voices, the crackle of fire, the steady march of soldiers, the whisper of waves reclaiming their secrets. History does not vanish. It waits quietly in the water, in the streets, in the silence between generations. It waits for someone to remember. Time moves on, but some stories remain suspended in it. Chicago has changed its face 1,000 times since 1919, but the undercurrent of that summer still runs beneath its streets like an unseen river. It flows through the old neighborhoods, through the alleyways where homes once burned, through the silence that follows each new tragedy. The city's towers gleam in the sun, their glass and steel catching the light like promises kept. But below them, the soil still remembers the smoke. Historians often describe the riot as an episode, a moment of madness in a turbulent era. But for those who understand its weight, it was not a moment. It was a mirror. a reflection of what America was, and in many ways, still is. When people speak of progress, they often speak of statistics. They talk about laws passed, jobs created, streets rebuilt. But numbers can never capture what was lost or what was learned. Progress cannot be measured in percentages. It is measured in memory, in empathy, in the willingness to face what others would rather forget. For decades, the riot was treated as an uncomfortable footnote in history, something to be skimmed over in classrooms and left out of official narratives. But truth has a persistence all its own. Like the tide on the lakefront, it keeps returning, washing away the sand until the buried bones begin to show. The Chicago Commission on Race Relations had once written that hatred is the most wasteful force in human history. 100 years later, those words ring just as true. The hatred that took Eugene Williams's life did not vanish when the riot ended. It evolved. It built systems and structures, quiet and efficient, that carried out the same work with less visible violence. But it also awakened something stronger, the will to resist. Every generation since has had to decide which side of that history it stands on. Some have chosen silence. Others have chosen courage. And slowly, through protest, through persistence, through the steady erosion of ignorance, something resembling understanding has begun to emerge. In 2019, on the centennial of the riot, Chicago held memorial events to honor those lost. At the same beach where Eugene drowned, people gathered in silence. Flowers were placed in the water. Descendants of survivors stood side by side, black, white, young, old, facing the same waves that once divided them. For a moment, the city seemed to breathe as one. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is where healing begins. Still, the work is far from finished. The echoes of 1919 continue to shape the city's reality, through economic disparity, through policing, through the lingering geography of segregation. The invisible lines drawn by fear have not yet been erased. But each generation has drawn closer to understanding that the true boundary was never in the streets or the sand. It was in the mind. And so, the story of the Chicago Race Riot is not simply the story of a city. It is the story of America itself. A country born in contradiction, forever struggling between its ideals and its instincts. It is the story of how easily fear can consume reason, and how courage must rise again and again to push it back. Somewhere in the city tonight, a child is learning this history for the first time. Perhaps they will walk to the lake and stare out across the water, imagining the boy who never made it home that day. They will see the skyline behind them, the lights reflected on the waves, and they will wonder how something so beautiful could come from a place that once burned so fiercely. And maybe they will understand something that Chicago has been trying to teach for more than a century: that beauty and brutality are never far apart, that progress demands honesty, and that remembrance is a form of resistance. The city is quieter now. The streets that once echoed with gunfire are filled with music and motion. But listen closely, and you might still hear it: the faint hum of history beneath the noise, the sound of the lake against the rocks, steady and indifferent, the heartbeat of a city still learning to forgive itself. The riot of 1919 is over, but the story it began is still being written. Every day, in every act of compassion, every demand for justice, every refusal to forget. And in the end, that may be its truest legacy. Not the flames, not the fear, but the enduring belief that even the darkest chapters of our past can light the way forward, if only we have the courage to read them. So when the city sleeps and the lake lies still, remember Eugene Williams, the boy whose death revealed the soul of a nation. Remember the families who rebuilt from ashes. Remember the silence of the police, the bravery of the soldiers, the fury of the crowds, and the quiet defiance of those who refused to leave. Because history is not just what happened. It is what we choose to remember. And forgetting is how it happens again. This is not the end of the story. It never is. It is only another shadow in the long corridor of time, another reminder that truth, though buried, never truly dies. This has been Shadow Chapters. If you found truth in this story, subscribe to join us as we continue to uncover the hidden histories that shaped our world. The forgotten, the forbidden, the untold. Because the past is never past. It's only waiting for someone to listen. See you in the next one.